Hello, class. So today I am doing my presentation on the history of European socialism with a specific focus on the Netherlands. My name is Alexander Ooms. Now, just to quickly start off, here are the contents of the presentation. So we'll start off with an introduction, then look at some historical context, then follow it with the early life and upbringing of Nieuwenhuis, as well as political trajectory and some of his thoughts and work, and then we'll finish it off with a comparison between reform and revolution, and then with a conclusion. Now, to start off, the introduction. So this is Ferdinand de Mella Nieuwenhuis, and he was the first socialist elected to the Dutch parliament in 1888, but he later became one of his strongest critics. His political trajectory reflects a broader tension within European socialism in the 19th century, when socialist movements were growing and increasingly participating in parliamentary politics. This raised an important question. Could socialism be achieved through gradual reform within existing institutions, or did those institutions themselves limit the possibility of real change? In this presentation, I argue that Nieuwenhuis represents a key turning point in this debate, showing how participation in parliamentary politics led some socialists to reject it entirely. Now, moving on to the historical context. So, by the late 19th century, industrialization had transformed European societies, creating a large working class facing long hours and poor conditions. Socialist movements grew rapidly, forming political parties, trade unions, and international organizations such as the Second International in 1889, which was formed in Paris. At the same time, European states were becoming more powerful and class tensions were increasing. As socialists began entering parliament, a major debate emerged over whether socialism could be achieved gradually through reform or whether deep structural change was necessary. Now, in the Netherlands, industrialization developed somewhat later than in other European countries, but it still produced growing social tensions. Socialist movements began to emerge, and Nieuwenhuis played a central role in introducing and spreading these ideas. Through both political participation and his newspaper, he helped shape early Dutch socialism, making his later critique to reform even more significant. At the center of Nieuwenhuis's argument is a critique of capitalism itself. He sees it as a system based on wage labor and private property, which produces inequality and maintains class divisions. Importantly, he argues that capitalism is flexible and can adapt to reforms, which is why he believes that reform alone cannot bring about real change. Now moving on to the early life and upbringing of Nieuwenhuis. So Nieuwenhuis was born in 1846 in Amsterdam into a Lutheran religious family and originally worked as a Protestant minister. His early life was shaped by strong moral concerns about justice and inequality. And through his experiences among poor communities, he became increasingly aware of social problems and began to question whether religion could provide real solutions. Over time, he turned towards socialism as a more practical way of addressing inequality, while maintaining a strong ethical commitment that influenced his later ideas. Nieuwenhuis became the first socialist elected to the Dutch parliament in 1888, as already mentioned, which marked an important step in political inclusion of the working class. At the same time, he helped shape socialist ideas through his involvement in the newspaper Recht voor Alle, which spread socialist and later anarchist ideas to a wider audience. Initially, he believed the parliamentary reform could improve workers' lives. However, his experience in parliament led to growing disillusionment. He came to see it as ineffective and limited by the capitalist system. Over time, he rejected parliamentary socialism and moved toward anarchism and a broader critique of the state. Now moving on to some of Nieuwenhuis's work. So to understand Nieuwenhuis's ideas, it is useful to look at several of his writings between 1889 and 1901. These texts address politics, war, and economic structures and show a clear development in his thinking. Across these sources, we can see a progression from criticism of reform to a broader rejection of both the state and capitalism. Taken together, they provide a more complete picture of the ideological position within European socialism. Now moving on to reform and its limits. In his 1889 speech on the 8-hour day, Neuenhuis argues that reforms within capitalism cannot eliminate exploitation. He criticizes Parliament as ineffective and shaped by the system it operates within, describing it as a space of endless discussion rather than meaningful action. Drawing on his experience, he suggests that even well intentioned representatives are constrained by broader economic structures. While reducing working hours could improve daily conditions, he insists that capital will adapt and maintain control, finding new ways to preserve profit and dominance. This suggests that reform may improve conditions without changing the underlying structure of society, leaving the fundamental relationship between labor and capital intact. He also warns that reforms can create a false sense of progress, leading workers to believe that meaningful change has been achieved when deeper inequalities remain. In this sense, reform risks stabilizing the system rather than challenging it, as concessions may reduce dissatisfaction without addressing its root causes. For Neuenhuis, the 8-hour day is therefore a tactical measure that can strengthen workers by giving them more time, energy, and capacity to organize, but is not a final solution. Instead, it should be understood as a part of a broader struggle aimed at confronting the deeper causes of inequality embedded within capitalist society. Now, moving on to the state and the war. So, by 1893, Neuenhuis expanded his critique beyond Parliament to the state itself. He argued that workers were being used in wars that served the interest of ruling elites rather than their own, and he called for resistance to military service and emphasized international solidarity among workers. This reflects broader geopolitical tensions in Europe at the time, including rising nationalism and militarization. His position shows a clear shift towards a more radical, anti state form of socialism. Now, moving on to the critique of social democracy. And so, by the mid 1890s, Neuenhuis had developed a strong critique of reformist socialism. He argued that social democratic movements risked becoming integrated into the capitalist system. So, instead of transforming society, reform may actually stabilize it by reducing conflict and opposition. This suggests that reform can reinforce a system it seeks to change. This reflects a wider ideological division within European socialism between reformist and revolutionary approaches. In his work, The History of Socialism, Neuenhuis presents socialism as a historical process rather than a fixed ideology. He distinguishes between authoritarian and libertarian traditions and clearly favors the latter. He also argues that early societies were based on forms of collective property, while private property developed later. This supports his view that capitalism is not permanent, but a historical system that may eventually be replaced. This shows that Neuenhuis is not only reacting to politics, but developing a broader theory of social and economic change. Now, moving on to reform compared to the revolution. So, these ideas reflect a fundamental divide within European socialism. Edward Bernstein, for example, argued that socialism could be achieved gradually through democratic and parliamentary reform. In contrast, Neuenhuis rejected this approach, arguing that political institutions were shaped by capitalism and could not bring about real change. This contrast highlights a central debate within socialism about whether change should happen within the system or require a break from it. Now, to conclude, Ferdinand de Mello Neuenhuis represents a key turning point in European socialism. His experience in Parliament led him to question the effectiveness of reform and to develop a broader critique of both capitalism and the state. His work highlights the limits of gradual change and raises important questions about the relationship between reform and transformation. These debates remain relevant today, making his ideas an important part of the history of European socialism. Thank you very much, and these are my sources.